So the talk is about PhpStorm. I'll give a little bit of background to PhpStorm. It's developed by a company called JetBrains. They also produce products for IntelliJ, PhpStorm itself, PyCharm, WebStorm, and ReSharper. And they also employ Nikita Popov, one of the core PHP developers who are working on PHP 8 at the moment. PhpStorm is a paid product, and to give you some idea of the costs, these are the first year costs. So for an individual, it starts off at £69 for the first year, then it drops down to £55 for the second year, and then £41 for 3 years onwards. For an organization, there's a cost per user, £149 for the first year, £119 for the second, and £89 for the third year onwards. PhpStorm is considered one of the best IDEs available for development on PHP. So I wanted to share how I got PhpStorm. It's all Steve's fault, basically. Every month, Steve would have a license for PhpStorm, which he gives away on the PHP South Wales Slack channel. And each month, somebody would volunteer. First person to reach to contact Steve would be able to get the free license. And I was unlucky for several months, and I had a nice Christmas present when it came to December, and I was successful in December, and I had a nice early Christmas present. One of the first thoughts that I had when I won this prize, when I paid for IDE from Steve, I needed to do it justice. Obviously, I've seen quite a few tutorials, YouTube tutorials. I've seen people using it, but I've never used it myself. So I now need to learn how to use this feature, and in particular, how its advanced features. Up to this point, I've been using VS Code for 2 years. So I've learned some of the common keyboard shortcuts, Control P to launch a program, F1 to pull up certain tasks. And I needed to relearn some of the common keyboard shortcuts that I learned. Shift was one of the first ones that I found extremely useful to find or search anywhere. And Control was another one, which was to run a particular program. I did think about mapping the same keyboard commands that I used in VS Code to PhpStorm, but I was just going to use it on multiple devices. I thought it was better to actually learn the PhpStorm keyboard shortcuts. So I didn't go down that particular route. The first impressions I had for PhpStorm, one of the noticeable differences is the time it takes to launch. And I'll come on to that in a bit more details later. PhpStorm, as I said, is an integrated development environment. It's an IDE. So by its nature, it is more complicated Then it's code editing, it's got debugging, there's database built in, there's version control, all in one package. Each project also needs to be set up on its own with its choice, for example, of PHP version. One of the problems that I encountered early on was with Laravel and with code completion. And I'll come on to that later of how I've managed to fix that. So what resources was I able to find for PhpStorm? Well, the answer to that is there's an awful lot of information out there. There's a lot of YouTube videos. Gary Hopkin in particular was one that I found very useful. At the time, Gary was a developer advocate for PhpStorm, and he was a developer advocate until about February, I believe, February 18, and Gary's now in Swansea. There's also a lot of information on the JetBrains website. There's lots of tutorials, quick start guides, what's new. There's lots of documentation. So there was a lot of information out there that I was able to find and use and get up to speed with the features and the advanced features that PhpStorm has to offer. It was one thing using a new package, but if I didn't know what advanced features were available, then obviously I wouldn't be able to target those particular features. There's even a Laracast by Jeffrey Way, How to Be Awesome in PhpStorm. Again, it's very useful to go through the Laracasts. So, as I mentioned earlier, the differences that I noticed between PhpStorm and VS Code. I've used VS Code for a couple of years. One of the very much noticeable differences is that PhpStorm takes a lot longer to launch. As you can see, I've actually done some comparisons to actually put some meat to that statement. I actually timed how long it takes to launch 3 different apps, Notepad++, VS Code, and PhpStorm, to give some idea of the comparison between the 3. Obviously, Notepad++ I would use to open a standard text document. That pretty much opens instantly, as you're aware, and it takes very little RAM. Whereas VS Code, on my test, took 4 seconds to launch, and that was into a Laravel project. And surprisingly, actually used about the same amount of RAM as PhpStorm, used about 0.78 gig. And when I launched PhpStorm, it took between 19 and 21 seconds and used 0.77 gig. This was the repeated time to open a project. One of the things that I noticed a lot on opening a brand new project from scratch, it obviously takes a lot longer. There's indexing going on and it used a lot more RAM. But the majority of the time you only open a brand new project once, and then it's a case of day by day going into the same project. So this is the reason why I've done the comparison this particular way. As I mentioned, PhpStorm is an IDE. It consists of a code editor. There's database tools, version control, debugging, testing, all in one package all integrated. Because it's designed as by the same people and they use the same philosophy, then it's a lot tighter integration in the one package. It also comes with WebStorm. WebStorm can be purchased as a separate purchase, but PHPStorm comes and it includes WebStorm. So that's for HTML, JavaScript, and CSS editing. Like VS Code, PHPStorm has plugins too. When a project is started, PHPStorm will make recommendations based on reading the composer JSON file. And when these files are loaded, the option to install the plugin is given. So for example, if you were to launch a Laravel project, first time you ever launch a Laravel project, it would offer to install the Laravel plugin. Some of the plugins that I've personally used are for .env file support, the Laravel plugin, which also needs Laravel IDE helper generator, and the PHP composer JSON support. I also tried the Markdown navigator, and I'll come on to Markdown later on in the slides. One of the reasons I started to learn PHP 3 years ago was to do with the system that I use in Cwmtaf called RedCap, which is a PHP project. It's a PHP website, similar to SurveyMonkey. It's used for research, electronic data capture. And when I put in the system, I obviously wanted to try and support it and develop it more. So as I work in the NHS, which has Windows servers, I have a slightly different work environment than most PHP developers. I use a WIMP stack, so I use Windows and IIS, as well as SQL, MySQL, and PHP, of course. When I'm at home and I'm doing side projects, then I use a LAMP stack or WAMP stack. If I wanted to launch a Laravel project, then I would install Laravel new and the project name, the same as everybody else. And then to install the IDE helper is a case of composer require dev Barry VDH Laravel IDE helper. And once that's installed, run the helpers. So there's PHP Artisan IDE helper generate, PHP Artisan IDE helper models, and PHP Artisan IDE helper meta, which then creates the information that PHPStorm needs to know how there's a Laravel project and can help with code generation. As I'm a programmer and I wanted to script it, I've written a little batch file. So each time that I spin up a new Laravel project, I can just run the batch file and it will automatically do the composer requires and run the helper software packages for me. So what do I think VS Code actually does better? As I mentioned, Markdown. One of the things that I found with PHPStorm is I didn't like the Markdown. The way it does it is integrated into PHPStorm, but I found that the free plugin from VS Code, the Markdown lint plugin, is much better. And there's been 1.5 million downloads for that plugin. The auto-completion, the linting, and the Markdown rules I found to be much better using this Markdown lint in VS Code. And I missed them when I went to PHPStorm. The environment is not the same. You haven't got the Markdown rules. Many of you may be thinking, what are Markdown rules? Basically, the designer for this particular plugin has taken the rules that Git has laid out and turned them into the rules for that particular plugin, and it advises the best layout, the best way to have Markdown written out. I also find that GitLens was much easier in VS Code than the VSC is in PhpStorm. To open individual files in PhpStorm when it isn't open, as we've touched on, it takes much longer to open than it does with VS Code. So to open a PHP file, I just want to have a look at an individual PHP file rather than open an entire project. If VS Code and PhpStorm isn't open, then I would right-click and open VS Code. And also VS Code is less complicated. There's less to learn. What are the benefits of PhpStorm? Well, to be honest, there are too many benefits to list. There are hours of video. There's documentation on what PHP can do. There's documentation online. Some of the highlights that I can advise is to do with code refactoring. An example of that is an if statement refactor. If you want to reverse an if statement, this is very easy to do in PhpStorm. To extract code into separate functions, and if you want, to rename a code, a method, or a variable. PhpStorm makes it very easy to rename any of these. As code is typed, the available method and properties are also listed, so code completion is a lot better in PhpStorm. Search anywhere, I mentioned already. If you press Shift twice, then you can search anywhere within the documentation. You can search anywhere within the IDE, so there's no need to remember all of the shortcuts. PhpStorm has local history, so there's automatic version control built into PhpStorm. Gives the ability to go back to files which haven't been committed but later needed. Once PhpStorm has been set up for debugging, it can debug using breakpoints directly in the browser. This needs PHP Helper for Chrome extension. PhpStorm has built-in linting with highlighting, and to go through any problems, it's just a case of pressing F2 to go to the next error. And as PhpStorm is a paid-for product, it does come with support. So if there's any problems, it's a case of raising a ticket. Here I put some information about the setup that I've developed. A lot of it is information that I found online and I've put into a particular gist. And I'll show you that now. So the gist will take you here. So everybody's just been blinded by the white light. Sorry about that. So it's broken down into two parts. First of all, there's tips and tricks of PhpStorm, which is a YouTube file that Gary has actually developed, which gives about 30 minutes of tips and techniques, command shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts, and I've broken down each one of these into each particular segment and what the shortcut is. So it's very easy, quick reference guides to find those particular links. And you feel free to have a look at through this at your own leisure. The second one is to do with the setup of a PHP project. And then again, these are just my notes. Anybody is free to have a look at these. It's particularly focused on a Laravel project. And some of the composer JSON settings that I use. The editor config, if there's an editor config automatically detected at the start of the project, then PHPStorm will take these editor config files and set up the project to use them. Xdebug, so to set up Xdebug in PHPStorm takes a little bit of setting up, and it's per project. So if there's a different version of PHP, you're using 7.4 in one project, and you go to a legacy project that's using an earlier version of PHP, then each project is set up with its own version of PHP and its own debugger. So I won't go into these in too much detail. This is a lightning talk. So hopefully you have a look through these. If they're of benefit to you, you're more than welcome to take a copy.